If you have a Bible, please turn with me to 1 Samuel chapter 30. We will continue on in the story of David. And this morning we're talking about David as he pursues the Amalekites. 1 Samuel chapter 30, beginning at verse 1. David and his men reached Ziklag on the third day. Now the Amalekites had raided the Negev and Ziklag. They'd attacked Ziklag and burned it, and had taken captive the women and all who were in it, both young and old. They killed none of them, but carried them off as they went on their way. When David and his men came to Ziklag, they found it destroyed by fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. So David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. David's two wives had been captured, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. Each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters. But David found strength in the Lord his God. Then David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, "Bring me the ephod." Abiathar brought it to him, and David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I pursue this raiding party? Will I overtake them?" "Pursue them," he answered. "You will certainly overtake them and succeed in the rescue." David and the 600 men with him came to the Bezer ravine, where some stayed behind, for 200 men were too exhausted to cross the ravine. But David and 400 men continued the pursuit. They found an Egyptian in a field and brought him to David. They gave him water to drink and food to eat, part of a cake of pressed figs and 2 cakes of raisins. He ate and was revived, for he had not eaten any food or drunk any water for 3 days and 3 nights. David asked him, "To whom do you belong and where do you come from?" He said, "I am an Egyptian, the slave of an Amalekite. My master abandoned me when I became ill 3 days ago. We raided the Negev of the Cherethites and the territory belonging to Judah and the Negev of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag." David asked him, "Can you lead me down to this raiding party?" He answered, "Swear to me before God that you will not kill me or hand me over to my master, and I will take you down to them." He led David down, and there they were scattered over the countryside, eating, drinking, and reveling because of the great amount of plunder they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from Judah. David fought them from dusk until evening of the next day, and none of them got away, except 400 men who rode off on camels and fled. David recovered everything the Amalekites had taken, including his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, young or old, boy or girl, plunder or anything else they had taken. David brought everything back. He took all the flocks and herds, and his men drove them ahead of the other livestock, saying, "This is David's plunder." Then David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow him and who were left behind at the Bezer ravine. They came out to meet David and the people with him. As David and his men approached, he greeted them. But all the evil men and troublemakers among David's followers said, "Because they did not go out with us, we will not share with them the plunder we recovered. However, each man may take his wife and children and go." David replied, "No, my brothers, you must not do that with what the Lord has given us. He has protected us and handed over to us the forces that came against us. Who will listen to what you say? The share of the man who stayed with the supplies is to be the same as that of him who went down to the battle. All will share alike." David made this a statute, an ordinance for Israel from that day to this. When David arrived in Ziklag, he sent some of the plunder to the elders of Judah, who were his friends, saying, "Here is a present for you from the plunder of the Lord's enemies." I went to Tim Hortons last week on my way to work. I often go to Tim Hortons on my way to work to grab a coffee. And as I was coming into the parking lot, I noticed that the car lineup was out to the road. And so I thought, well, I guess I'll just park my vehicle and zip inside because it looked like the line was shorter. So I did that. I jumped in the line inside. It was quite a bit shorter. There was 2 people ahead of me, and I stood there for a little while, and the line didn't move, and thought it was kind of strange. It's not usual at Tim Hortons. It goes pretty quickly, and then I looked and I noticed on they have these little screens in the back that have all the orders lined up, and you could see a couple of orders that were just jam-packed. The screen was packed like somebody just went in and ordered the whole place. And I'm like, okay, this is going to take a while. And so I stood there and watched and waited and watched the reactions of people, and I saw the line as it continued to grow. And it wasn't long before that line was out the door, and you could see people looking down the row and looking behind the screen, and you could see their eyebrows were slowly going down and down and down, and they're looking at their watches, and then you begin to hear people mumbling under their breath, and many things that I cannot repeat here in church, as they're impatiently waiting for someone to take their order, to take their coffee, so they can go to work or to wherever else they're going. And in looking behind the counter, all I saw were frantic people with fear in their eyes. The manager frantically trying to make sure things were getting done, and all the people walking around with empty coffee pots looking for another coffee pot that was full, and you could just see that they were stressed out trying to get these orders done while people were just angry in the lineup wanting their coffee. We live in a grace-deprived world. We see pockets of grace here and there, but in general, our world is not a very gracious place. Grace is not easily handed out by people. Instead, mankind is more prone to fight for what it considers to be fair. And by the end of the fight, what we are left with many times doesn't seem fair at all. The story we read this morning is about grace. David and his men had been rejected by the Philistine army, sent home to sit out the battle. And they returned to find that their hometown had been raided by the Amalekites, the people whom David and his men had been warring against during their time among the Philistines. The Amalekites returned the favor by attacking Ziklag, burning it, and taking everyone as captives. David in his distress called out to God, and God answered him. David was told that if he pursued the Amalekites, God would give him victory. When David finally caught up to the Amalekites, he was able to defeat them and bring his people back home. When we take a closer look at this story, we see that there is grace all through it. And this morning I'd like to look at how God extended grace to David by saving his family, even though he was undeserving of it. I'd also like to look at how some of the men with David's armies did not see or respond correctly to God's grace. And finally, I'd like to look at how David responded to God's grace. And through it all, my hope is that we remember again how important grace is in our own lives. David's first response when we learn of his family's captivity was to seek God. And as we've been reading through 1 Samuel, we've seen it over and over again. David in trouble turns to God. David looked to God for answers. And you know, God could have held David's mistake over his head. He could have let him feel the effects of his sin. David had gotten himself into this mess. God could have let it be a lesson for him to learn through some pain. He could have let the Amalekites wipe out the town of Ziklag, as David had done to a number of the Amalekite villages. He could have allowed David to experience what it was like. He could have let the Amalekites harm and abuse the people of Ziklag so that they returned beaten and broken. Instead, God extended undeserved grace to David and his family. And it was an extravagant grace. God could have simply just given David victory over the Amalekites. But he did more. He kept David's family and possessions safe from harm. And I'm guessing that this experience would have stuck out in David's mind. He knew what a destroyed village and decimated people looked like. He would have known what the destructive scene could have looked like. He would most likely have been expecting that some of the women and children had been killed, and the ones that were not killed would have been abused or harmed in some way. None of these instances is what David found. Instead, he found not only his family, but all of the families completely unharmed. None of his possessions were missing. And this would no doubt have impacted David's life. This is an example of God's grace. God's grace is a gift given not because of something we have done. David's family was not spared because of what David had done, but because of who God is. The Bible is a story of his grace to mankind. God has been gracious to all of us, and it is an overflowing grace, an over-the-top grace. He gives us so much more than we can even imagine. We were a people lost in our sin, longing to be set free from the sin that is in our lives. We were a hopeless people, unable to fix our situation. And God in his grace made it possible through the death of Jesus Christ on the cross. He paid the penalty for sin so that we could be set free. And he took our place so that we could be forgiven. This is God's ultimate example of his grace to mankind. God did not just fix an earthly problem, he fixed an eternal problem. The problem of separation from God. He did not only save us from our sins, he gave us a hope of eternity that will never spoil or fade. Great reward for those who believe in him and give their lives to him. God's grace is an overflowing grace. God's protection of David's family and the victorious battle is just a sample of this over-the-top grace that God gives. Yet so much of mankind is blind to grace, or if they experience it, they quickly forget about it. A number of men in David's army were quick to forget about God's grace to their families. Instead, on the journey home, they anticipated how David was about to divide up the spoils of war. And instead of being thankful for the victory God had given them, they were more concerned about the rules for who would get what. They had in their own minds began to devise a system of fair. What is the fair way to divide things up? Should more go to those who risk more? Should more go to those who had the ability to continue on with David? Some of the men had very strong opinion as to how things should be divided up. They said, each man may take his wife and children and go. You can kind of see what was going through their minds in this. You know, we were kind enough to to save your women and children. We were kind enough to bring them back with us to you. So here you go. You can have them. But don't even think about getting the spoils of war. You did nothing for them. You were unable to handle the rigors of battle. You were unable to keep up. The Bible calls these men evil men. It labels them as troublemakers. They were ungracious, even though they had most likely determined in their own minds that they were being fair. These men held back the blessing of God and instead were more concerned for their own well-being. You know, thoughts about what is fair start at a very young age. If you have been around kids, you know exactly what I mean. How many times have you heard kids say, "That's not fair"? I can't think of the amount of times I've heard it at my house. That statement, "That's not fair." You're dividing something up for your kids, and so one of your kids gets a little bit extra as you kind of didn't quite measure it properly. And what's the reaction? An outcry from the rest. Have you ever seen a child get a little extra and cry out, "That's not fair. I got too much"? Have you ever heard it? I've never heard it. Not yet anyways, and I'm guessing if it exists, it's an anomaly. Because even from childhood, our sense of fair is warped. Because it is wrapped up in us. Is it much different from the adult world? We might be a bit more crafty in how it comes across. We might have to keep our intentions hidden a little bit. We might not even realize we're doing it at all. The truth is, we should be suspect of what we view as fair, even now as adults. These troublemakers in David's army held tightly to their view of fair, and they completely missed the point that the only reason they stood with plunder in their hands was because God was gracious enough to give them victory. And the only reason they were able to hold on to their families was because God, by his grace, made sure they were safe and unharmed. Be wary of your view of fair. It has the ability to draw us towards evil. Do you find yourself holding on to a sense of entitlement? Do you feel people should be listening to you? Are you quick to dig your heels in when you're not getting your way? Do you find yourself prone to being argumentative rather than employing a more peaceful means of settling arguments? Which of us could say that we don't? I don't think any of us have not struggled with causing trouble for others at one time or another. Just ask my wife. She sees it in me every once in a while. I'd have to admit that I haven't always been that gracious on the phone to those working in the customer service industry. Maybe you can say the same thing. Talking on the phone to the customer service industry. Are we that kind? I haven't always been that nice. And I'd like to think it's no big deal. It's just a way of maneuvering ourselves. Doesn't the squeaky wheel get the grease? But does it not cause trouble for others? Does it not cause people pain? Jesus told a parable in Matthew chapter 18 about an unmerciful servant. This servant owed the king the equivalent of millions of dollars. And the king forgave his debt. But the unmerciful servant would not forgive the few dollars that was owed him by a fellow servant. The truth is, the wicked servant was owed money. He had a right to collect it. But he was called the wicked servant because he was not gracious when he himself had been extended an insurmountable amount of grace. Instead, he held on to the truth that someone owed him. And by holding on to this truth, he stood in opposition to the king. And in his situation in the end, got a whole lot worse. The men with David were distracted by their own sense of what was fair. What about those men who stayed behind? What about those who didn't have the stamina to keep up with David in the pursuit of the Amalekites? The truth is, they were no help to David and his men in the battlefield. The truth is, they gave up on the chase. The truth is, they were not strong enough to continue on. The truth. If we hold on to the truth without grace, we are not following Jesus' example. Look at the description of Jesus in John chapter 1 at verse 14 where it says, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." Jesus, who came down to earth, was full of grace and truth. Truth without grace is judgmental. And grace without truth has no power. It is important to treat them in balance. But in our culture, we feel the need to emphasize truth above grace because we live in a culture that seems to have sidelined the truth. You've heard it before. Truth is relative. That's what our culture believes. And we feel we must counter this culture with a blazing fire of truth. And I'm not saying that truth is not important. Truth is very important. But when we fixate on the truth without understanding God's grace, we find ourselves tempted to sit in the seat of the judge. It begins to affect how we treat those of weakness. We begin to think, what's wrong with you? How come you keep messing up? How come you're not more spiritual? We become tempted to think we are more deserving because of what we have done, or how we have helped, or how we've resisted. that we are in some way better. Like the troublemakers among David's men, an emphasis on fairness tempts us to focus on our actions, to see them as the important benchmark rather than the grace of God. We fall into the temptation of being more concerned about people conforming rather than being transformed by the grace of God. David was struck by the grace of God. His response to that grace was to be gracious to the 200 men who were too exhausted to follow David into the battle. He didn't listen to the suggestion of the evil men. In verse 23, he said, "No, my brothers, we must not do that with what the Lord has given us." He recognized that his success was not by human hands. Imagine what this would have meant for the soldiers who were left behind. The soldiers that couldn't make it. There was little doubt that they were ashamed of their inability to keep up with David. They were left with a full view of their glaring weakness. Yet David was gracious towards them. What a powerful moment that would have been. Think of the times that people have been gracious to you. How much of an impact did that have on your life? Grace can be a powerful thing, able to relieve tensions and anger, able to humble people, able to change people's minds, and make amends in places where you thought it would be impossible. David went a step further and made a lasting ordinance based on grace. The share of the man who stayed with the supplies is to be the same as that of him who went down to the battle. All will share alike. He could have made an ordinance based on fair. Those who worked harder, who were more gifted, who sacrificed more, or who had more ability would be given more than those who didn't. Can you imagine the type of attitude in people if that was the ordinance? Instead, he made an ordinance based on grace, a continual reminder of who we are in Christ. And being a people of grace does not weaken the truth. It puts truth back into the hands of God. David also showed the grace of God through his generosity. He could have seen the victory as an opportunity to hold on to the power of riches, to be built up as he gathered momentum towards the throne in Israel. And he could have argued that it was God's blessing to him and that he had every right to hold on to it, to keep it. Instead, he gave some of the plunder to the places where he stayed, blessing the people who had been with him in his exile. David's response to God's grace was to be generous. How well do we share? It is an important lesson we try to instill in our kids. But how good are we at it? It doesn't matter if you have a lot or if you have a little. Sharing is not always that easy. It does become easier, though, out of a right understanding of God. All we have is from God. A sharp mind, support systems, opportunities, health, financial stability. We may like to think that we are masters of our own destiny, but we are nowhere without God. Amen. And it would take him very little to take it all away. Amen. Like David, we should be known as a generous people. Generous with what we have, generous with our time, generous with our empathy and kindness towards others. The grace of God should impact our lives in very tangible ways. It should affect the way that we live. It should make us different from the world in which we live. People should be able to see God's Spirit at work in our lives. I was at a youth conference 2 weekends ago down in Vancouver, a Canadian Youth Workers Convention. And in one of the breakout sessions, there was a survey that discussed, among other things, why young people were leaving the church. One of the reasons young people are leaving the church is because it's not extraordinary. They look at the church and see a people who hold tightly to a thought, but see little effect of it on their lives. They see church people acting much the same as the world does, people being quite ordinary. They see that we can be just as ungracious, just as mean-spirited, just as much troublemakers. Youth who are looking for something to powerfully change them and fill their lives don't see the power offered from the church. Young people want to know that the gospel of grace is real and that it has the power to change people. They do not want to follow a belief. They want to follow what will change their lives. They don't want to be a part of a club or a group. For some of them, it seems like a pretty lame group, a pretty lame club. You get together and you do what? No thanks. We cannot compete with what the world has to offer as far as excitement and thrills. But we can blow the competition away when we live a life of grace, when we live as grace-filled believers. Because it shows something within us that is bigger than ourselves. The world cannot offer that because it doesn't have it. And it is what the empty heart is yearning for. If we don't extend the grace of Jesus in our lives, it should be no surprise when we see people walking away. But when we allow the grace of God to fill us and to overflow to those around us, it causes people to notice. It has the power to draw people because its source is God. This story in Scripture gives us a reminder of what grace looks like. We are surrounded by a world that does not extend grace that easily. And it's quite difficult for us not to get trapped by the same things, to jump in line with everyone else, to join the world in vying for what we want and keeping the power firmly gripped in our hands, to be consumed with what is fair. Instead, we need to be a people of grace and truth. I've had to repent of my own troublemaking ways, and most likely not done with that yet. But as God shapes grace in my life, I am blessed by the fruit of that grace. God was gracious to David. He saved his family and gave him much more than he deserved. The troublemakers around David missed God's grace to them and were instead consumed with their view of what was fair. David realized the grace of God, and he responded in grace to others. Don't be a troublemaker. Be a distributor of grace.